Okay, and our final speaker has arrived. Dr. Natasha Tassell-Matamua is a senior lecturer of psychology at Massey University in Palmerston North. She's a cultural psychologist who's interested in indigenous psychology, particularly Mataranga Maori, with a focus on its relation to ethics, spirituality, well-being, and the environment. And she also researches exceptional human experiences, including near-death experiences, which she's going to be talking about today. So please join me in welcoming the newly arrived Dr. Tassell-Matamua.
Good morning, everyone. I'm guessing many of us here have heard stories of people who claim to have died and then come back to life. And then they tell these extraordinary tales of all sorts of amazing things, such as seeing bright lights and dead people, and all manner of sort of things that we sort of think and sit back and think, I'm not really sure I understand or believe that. But my mum was actually one of these people. She died when I was 6.5 of breast cancer, and I was there when she died, when she passed away. And I remember the day quite clearly, which of course you do when it's a significant event in your life. She was lying on the couch. I was sort of cuddled into my dad, standing next to her, and my brother and sister were also cuddled into Dad. And I do recall sort of looking over at my dad's face and seeing what I now know to be an expression of grief on his face. He had trembling lips and his eyes were all watery. And I remember just standing there being an observer of this. But my mum laid on the couch and she said, I can see a bright light. And then she described that she was moving through a tunnel and she felt at peace and she no longer felt that she was in pain. And then she passed away. And then about 2 minutes later, she came back to life. And she sort of semi-sat up and addressed the room and said to everyone in the room, there is a heaven, I've been there before, and it's beautiful. And then that was it. She passed away very, very peacefully. So now, 34 years later, I'm a researcher and a senior lecturer at Massey University. And for the past decade, I've been researching stories such as the one similar to what my mum experienced. I've spoken to hundreds of people. People have called me on the phone. They've come in to see me at the university. On occasion, we've even had Skype calls. And they've described their experience of being near death, having this amazing sort of psychological experience, and then coming back to life. I've also had hundreds of people email me and send letters about their experience as well. And all of them describe very similar things, this amazing psychological occurrence that occurred at a time when they believed or were verifiably dead. And then they've come back to life and have been able to tell the story. So each of these experiences have been very unique. They've all contravened many of our common everyday understandings of life, but also of death. They can't readily be explained, as far as I'm aware anyway, by current scientific theories or models. But most importantly, everyone I've spoken to about their experience has come away feeling completely changed, profoundly changed. And one of the, most important changes that have occurred is people's view or attitudes towards death. But I'll talk about that shortly. I guess what people might want to know is, well, what are these experiences? And hopefully I'm going to do this right. Well, mostly these experiences appear to occur on the precipice between life and death. And now I say they occur on the precipice because many people who I've spoken to have explained how when they had their experience, their physiological condition could, at best, at the time, be described as severely compromised, or at worst, it was non-functional, so they were, effectively clinically dead. So, unlike my mum, who passed away or passed over shortly after she saw her bright lights and went through the tunnel, the people who have shared their experiences with me have literally been on the border between physical life and physical death. And it's probably for this reason that experiences of this nature have been given the term near-death experiences. It's not a term that I've given them. It's a term that a man called Raymond Moody, who many of you may have heard of, gave to describe experiences of this nature. And he coined the term around about the time I was born in the late 70s. But near-death experiences are characterised by, or tend to be characterised by, a number of common features. So, like my mum, she talked about seeing bright lights and travelling through a tunnel and feelings of peace. A lot of people who I've spoken to have also spoken about these things. But near-death experiences can include other things as well. So the overwhelming positive emotions that my mum experienced, peace, but people often say they experience joy, happiness, unconditional love. Travel through a tunnel, this is often done, apparently, at very high speeds, or it has the perception of being done at a very high speed. Travel to otherworldly realms or locations are also often described. A sense of interconnectedness or unity with all living beings can be felt as well. And interestingly, people can also report having a life review. And what I find interesting about the life reviews is that people will not only relive or recall virtually every moment of their life, but they also seem to have an awareness of the impact of their thoughts and behaviours on other people, both good and both not so good as well. People can also describe a sense of disembodiment as well as a host of other features. And while most of these features tend to be described in very pleasant terms, people have described to me unpleasant or terminology that sort of indicates that their experience was perhaps unpleasant. So they might say, well, rather than a tunnel, I felt I was sort of floating through a void. Or they might say that they felt quite anxious about the experience initially before sort of letting go and finding themselves enjoying it. So the advent of modern technology has resulted in a lot more survival of people. Our resuscitation efforts tend to be a lot more effective nowadays than what they used to be. So people tend to survive near-fatal encounters, and as a consequence, it appears that people are reporting them more as well. The most, recent research tends to suggest that maybe between 5 to 25% of people who have had a near-fatal encounter and cardiac arrest will report a near-death experience. This doesn't mean that that is the amount of people that actually have a near-death experience. Researchers in the area tend to think that people, or the experiences are underreported. People tend not to report them as much as what they actually occur. And of course, our age of social media, the madness that is popular social media, means that these experiences, when they're broadcast, they're often sort of communicated with a lot of vim and vigour around the world in various ways. And this probably gives the impression that they are experienced a lot more now than what they have been in the past. But this isn't actually true. What we do know is that throughout history and across cultures, experiences that appear to approximate or reflect near-death experiences have been reported. And one of the earliest known, intact accounts of a near-death experience was actually in Plato's Republic, which impressively was written in about 380 BC. So near-death experiences are by no stretch a new sort of fad. They've been around for quite some time, or been reported for quite some time. So they're definitely unique, they're profound, and they're also very complex in nature. They challenge many of our common understandings of what reality is and of course what it isn't as well. But most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, people that have these experiences tend to be undeniably and uncompromisingly changed by the experience, and that change lasts over a lifetime. And one of the changes that tends to be most immediately felt by people who have these experiences is a change in their attitude towards death. And most of the studies reveal, or studies that have been conducted by myself and others, looking at people who have had a near-death experience and those that have had a close brush with death but without a near-death experience, tend to show that the attitudes or beliefs around death tend to be quite different for the two groups. So those who have had a near-death experience overwhelmingly indicate that they feel less threatened by death, but they also overwhelmingly indicate that they are no longer afraid of it. And so this loss of the fear of death is also, as I mentioned before, maintained over time. They never, the fear of dying never seems to revisit them at all, which I think must be quite a pleasant thing. And although traumatic events we would expect, I guess, a close brush with death to often lead people to reassess their core values and I guess their assumptions about life and death, research indicates that it tends to be the psychological element of the near-death experience rather than the physiological close brush with death that seems to be the catalyst for the change in attitudes towards death. So I think it's quite noteworthy that, a near-death experience, often they appear to occur, even though the experience itself might feel long for the person having it. The time span in which it appears to occur is actually quite fleeting, as long as perhaps a cardiac arrest. So I think it's really noteworthy that an experience that is that short in nature can cause such a significant and profound change in people's core beliefs about death. And I work, as I mentioned, in the School of Psychology, and I think I can say with some certainty that most of our established psychological interventions that we have just couldn't come close to affecting the same amount of change as what a near-death experience does in people. So by their own admission, people that have these experiences, they're no longer afraid of death, even if they admit to having feared death prior to their experience. But importantly, they also say, not all, but most, say that they now have a belief in some sort of afterlife, even if they didn't have this belief before they had their near-death experience. Which, of course, begs the question of, well, why? Why the change? Why do they now believe in some sort of afterlife when prior to the experience they didn't? And I think one of the reasons for this is because many who have a near-death experience will come away with the complete conviction, and I mean complete conviction, that some aspect of their self, perhaps they might describe it as a spirit, or their soul, or their consciousness, continued beyond the confines of their physical body. They have the complete conviction that that occurred. And in particular, I'm sure many of you would have heard of out-of-body experiences before. And when these seem to occur, or when they tend to occur in people when they have a near-death experience, they seem to imply to the person, or they seem to imply to us as researchers, that perhaps there is some non-physical aspect that survives bodily death, even if only temporarily. So out-of-body experiences typically involve an individual feeling as if their point of consciousness is removed from their physical body. And often they'll say that, I felt like I was in the corner of the room and I was looking down on my body and I could see everything happening around me and what people were doing to my body. Or they might be in the corner of the room watching their body and they can see somehow or have the perception of a relative down the hall crying or being upset that they're in hospital, depending on the situation, of course. And a recent sort of case that's been published, I think, really highlights well this notion of out-of-body experience and how it can bring about a certain change in belief. So it's a case of a 57-year-old man, and he'd suffered ventricular fibrillation, and he described perceiving events related to his resuscitation. And he said, well, I felt like I was just up in the corner of the room over there, and I was just sort of watching what was happening around my body at the time. And he accurately described the people and the events that occurred during his resuscitation, but also, very interestingly, he also described a sound that occurred 3 minutes after his cardiac arrest. So 3 minutes afterwards, you wouldn't expect that a man who has no sort of physiological functioning would be able to perceive anything. And yet he was able to accurately describe not only visual information, but also auditory information, which is really important. In the near-death sort of research area, we have a lot of cases of people who talk about having visual information during an OBE, but it's very rare that they talk about and are able to have verified auditory information as well. So as outrageous as this statement might seem, the disembodiment that is experienced during near-death experiences points to the continuation of a non-physical aspect of ourselves after physical death. But I guess the key question is, and I'm not saying that is what happens, I'm saying that's what the information appears to point to. I guess the key question is, or key questions are, well, how is this possible? And if there is a non-physical aspect that continues afterwards, where does it continue? And of course, I guess another key question is, well, how long does it continue for? So another reason why those who have near-death experiences might be inclined to believe in an afterlife might be because often they report seeing a deceased significant other during their experience. And these deceased others usually provide comfort and support to the individual. Particularly intriguing are cases where the person who had the near-death experience comes back and says, well, I saw so-and-so, but they weren't aware that so-and-so had actually passed away. And a tragic example, I guess, that I'll recall is the account of a 9-year-old boy, and his name is Eddie. He had been in fever for about 36 hours and unconscious, and he suddenly awoke at about 3 a.m. in the morning, and he very urgently told his dad, who was obviously there waiting, sitting next to him, that he'd been to heaven, he'd seen his grandma, he'd seen his auntie, and he'd seen his uncle. And his dad thought, okay, yep, fair enough. But then he said, oh, and I saw Teresa as well. And Teresa was his 19-year-old sister, and she was at university. His dad became a little bit upset at that point because he'd just spoken to Teresa 2 nights earlier on the phone, and she was fine. So later on that morning, Eddie's and Teresa's parents phoned the university just to check on her well-being, only to discover that the university had been trying to get hold of them at home, but of course they couldn't because they were in hospital with Eddie, to let them know that Teresa had been killed in a car accident at 12 o'clock the evening before. So as I mentioned, as tragic as it sounds, that story and cases like this point to something I think very interesting and important. It suggests that if people who have near-death experiences encounter other deceased beings when they themselves have passed over, then perhaps it suggests that there's a continuation of others after physical death also. So the question again, or the questions again are, well, how? How does this happen? And if these others, deceased others, continue, where do they go and where do they continue? And of course, how long do they continue for? A third reason why people who have near-death experiences might be more inclined to believe in an afterlife is because they might encounter, and often many do, have an encounter, with what they consider to be the divine. So many people indicate or report that they are drawn to an ineffable presence during their near-death experience. The presence is often described, like my mother described, as a bright light. It can be described as a luminous being and a spiritual being. Often people say it was an all-encompassing presence, that they really find difficulty in trying to articulate the correct words to describe this thing this encounter that they have. But very often they will say, well, it just felt like it was maybe the creator of all things, some powerful being or entity. So the being appears to have the function of imparting unconditional love and, for want of a better word, support to these individuals during their near-death experience. And when people have encountered this being, they often say that the being sort of helped them or facilitated them feeling this sense of cosmic unity. And often the being will give them a choice of whether they return to their physical body or not, or will say to them, actually, you know, you've got, or communicate to them, you've got some purpose or mission to fulfill before you're allowed to return here. Which again begs the question of, well, where is here? When they're saying you can return here, what do they mean by that? Where is this here? And I think, really importantly, many people who have near-death experiences and encounter these beings say that they're given an understanding of what the purpose and the meaning of life is. You know, the great philosophical question, I guess, that many of us ask ourselves, maybe from time to time, or ponder, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? What are we doing? What's our purpose? And they're told that we're here to experience and we're here to learn lessons. But most importantly, we are here to love unconditionally, not only ourselves, but also others. And not only others that are close to us, but all living beings. So many come back feeling that that's the most important message that they get out of their near-death experience, which I think is something we can all learn from as well. But whatever form this being takes, it is almost without exception perceived in a positive way by people who have near-death experiences. It seems to catalyse significant transformations, not only in relation to attitudes towards death, but other things in life as well. And those people who have near-death experiences are often convinced that the being represents a divine presence. But again, it begs the question, well, who is this being and whereabouts do they reside? And a final reason why I think people who have near-death experiences come back from their experience with the conviction that there is an afterlife is because they will encounter often, but not always, an otherworldly realm or dimension. And like my mum, many people will say that, or will talk about this realm in a very pleasant way. My mum described it as heaven. I'm not sure what heaven might have meant to her, but I guess when we use that term, it does conjure up sort of pleasant imagery for most of us. So people will often describe seeing beautiful vistas that can include mountains, lakes, rivers, flowers. Sometimes they'll encounter buildings or rooms or scenes. More often than not, these places are described in very pleasant terms. And I think the example of a young woman who had been in A&E in a very bad way sort of highlights this well. She was obviously lying there unconscious, heard or perceived the doctor saying, well, there's nothing more we can do for her. And then at that point she said she was propelled out of her body up into the corner of the room, and she was watching events unfolding around her physical body. And then she eventually moved on, and she recounts having this journey to a wall, and she was able to float up above and onto the other side of the wall and see this beautiful vista. And she described it simply as the most beautiful, the most peaceful, and the most amazing place that she could ever imagine. She said it was breathtakingly beautiful. It was like no landscape at all on Earth. So I guess the question is what and where this dimension is and how we get there is still yet to be answered with any certainty. Yet people who have had a near-death experience suggest, or they will suggest to us, as the case of my mother suggested, I guess, was that there must be some non-physical aspect of ourself or ourselves that perhaps moves on to another dimension after the demise of the physical body. So I think my time's nearly up. So I just want to end by saying, the question of whether there is an afterlife is likely to continue to be asked for, I think, decades to come. I'm not entirely sure whether it's centuries, but I think decades is probably a good bet. And without doubt, many will probably still state that this is a question that really can only be answered upon our own deaths. So I guess I can give you one guarantee today, and that's, a 100% guarantee that at some stage we'll be able to find out the answer to this ourselves. But until then, I think we can use the near-death experience to give us a little bit more information about that. So the typical characteristics of these experiences usually provide persuasive, really persuasive, experiential evidence to the people that have them that something, whether that be their soul, their spirit, their consciousness, survives bodily death and moves on to somewhere. Persuasive evidence, they really are moved by this. But what exactly, it also strengthens their conviction that there is something called an afterlife, however they conceive of it. But what exactly the afterlife might be is also a question, I think, that is ripe for debate, and probably why, many of you are here today and have been here over the weekend. The afterlife, perhaps it is a place. I'm not sure. Perhaps it is a state of mind. Again, I'm not really sure. Perhaps it's just simply a momentary sort of occurrence that our brain is hardwired to produce at the moment that our body begins to sort of close down and we die. But whatever the afterlife is, the fact that the fleeting phenomena, or a fleeting phenomena like the near-death experience, can have such a profound impact on those who have them and point them or move them in the direction of believing that there is an afterlife, even if they didn't believe so before, is, I believe, a very fascinating thing.